Thank you, Dirk. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have been given the challenging task to present just after lunch. So the challenging task just to make sure you keep awake. So let's do our best. I have a presentation containing of 6 parts, starting with a little bit of the background on the data that we have collected during the course of Be Good. And this work has been done within the work package 4 that dealt with the socio-economics of beekeeping. So the results that I will share with you, they are based on a set of personal in-depth interviews with stakeholders, a wide diversity of stakeholders involved in the European beekeeping sector. That was the first wave of data collection from our side in Be Good in 2020. Then the second part was a survey with stakeholders again. 2021, we had a sample of more than 500 stakeholders who completed our online survey. And finally, the major part of data collection was a survey with beekeepers done in 2022. We started at the end of 21, where we had more than 840 pan-European beekeepers completing the survey. I will share some results from each of those studies, but starting perhaps with this one, the cross-sectional stakeholder survey, the 504 participants. This first table here gives you an overview of the type of stakeholders that we interviewed. So we had 8 categories, and that ranged from scientists over service providers to beekeepers, quality inspectors, policymakers as well, actors in the agricultural, horticultural sector, as well as actors in industry, and also NGO representatives. And many of those participants, they had multiple relations with the beekeeping sector, and that's indicated here in the primary activity column. So we had 79 who indicated that their primary connection to beekeeping was being a scientist. But in addition, we also had another 40 who called themselves scientists as a secondary activity. And that's because a lot of those stakeholders, of course, they were active in a particular sector, and at the same time, they were beekeepers themselves back at home. Just to indicate that, yeah, we have a substantial number of beekeepers in the sample. Now, based on the data that we collected from this sample, one of the results was this here. We exposed those participants to a set of questions aiming at the identification of policy priorities for healthy and sustainable beekeeping. And the method we used was the so-called analytical hierarchy process methodology. So that consists...
Tudo bem? Olha, Dinis, estava-te a ligar para...
That's live translation, I assume? No? Okay.
Sorry, Wim, I think that was somebody online. We just muted them, sorry.
No, don't worry. Okay. So one of the results we got from this data set was a list of possible policy priorities relating to sustainable beekeeping. And the ones that are indicated here in green, they relate to the ecological dimension of sustainability. The ones in orange relate to the social dimension of sustainability. And the ones in blue relate to the economic dimension of sustainability. So, according to stakeholders, priority should be given from a policy perspective to increased agricultural crop diversification, stricter regulation on pesticide use. Haven't we seen the opposite very recently? And increased use of pesticide alternatives. Clearly, the economic component ranks lower. And interestingly, here at the bottom, we see increased use of hive monitoring technology. And I point specifically to that because this has raised some questions during one of the review meetings where it was said, well, how do you explain that a project like BeGood is focusing on the use of hive monitoring technology, whereas it ranks the lowest in this analysis? Well, actually, the explanation is straightforward because this is clearly not seen as something that should be prioritized from a policy perspective. This is not about policy, it's about activities that are taken by private businesses and by individual beekeepers. So this is not on the policy agenda. And because of that explicitly, and I wanted to share it here, because of that, I'm going to focus more in depth on this specific topic later on in this presentation. Then the beekeeper survey with 844 participants. We also received some questions about, okay, but how valid is your measurement? Because this is not a random sample, and indeed it is not a random sample. We don't even know if it is a representative sample because there are no census data about beekeepers and their profile in each of the target countries. So we checked about the external validity in two ways. First, we compared the average honey yield per hive in our study sample with data that were available from the National Apiculture Programs 2020-22. And of course, because we are referring to different years, those numbers do not exactly match. Also, the way they are calculated is not really matching. We had the total honey production divided by the total number of productive hives in 2021. But importantly, we see a gradient in our data, the black bars, that is very similar to the gradient compared to the data from the national apiculture programs, with Finland scoring highest, and then France, Bulgaria, Portugal scoring lower in terms of average honey yield per hive. Second, and that brings us closer to what's on the agenda for the next couple of days, we also compared the winter loss data that were reported by beekeepers in our sample as the average winter loss percentage over the past 5 years, categorical data, so that's a very rough estimate. I admit this is by no means compares to the accuracy of the data collected in COLAS, but still, when we compare the results from our survey, the black bars again, we see that we obtain a very similar gradient as in the COLAS data. Again, the years are not the same, and of course, there are some extremes in some of the COLAS data, depending on the year. So external validity was quite okay. That's what we would like to flag with this. Let me take a couple of steps back and discuss with you some of the findings of the stakeholder interviews. We had 41 stakeholders. They were interviewed quite extensively during 1.5 to 2 hours. And one of our main objectives here was to perform a SWOT analysis of the beekeeping sector in Europe. First, we identified 24 internal characteristics of the European beekeeping sector. And those characteristics, they were evaluated more in detail in a quantitative phase by 28 of those stakeholders. And that led to the identification of 5 strengths, 5 weaknesses, which were then consecutively also prioritized based on the internal consciousness, how well the beekeeping sector is aware of these strengths or weaknesses, and perceived advantage, disadvantage. So we used this classification scheme, which is there mainly to illustrate what we did. This is the main result from that analysis. And so on the 2 dimensions, internal consciousness and perceived advantage or disadvantage, we plotted the strengths, we plotted the weaknesses. And for example, if we look at some of them, strength number 3, which scores in the upper right corner, refers to the fact that honeybees are recognized as providing multiple ecosystem services with relevance to agriculture, to food production, to the environment, and to biodiversity. So that's clearly something that this beekeeping sector can and should capitalize on in its future development. Weakness 11, and that's the one that is scoring here, is providing a strong perceived disadvantage because it scores so low over here. Okay, yep. Like this. Yeah, but okay. Yeah. Okay, so weakness 11 is positioned over here. So that has to do with beekeepers that have quite a character sometimes. So they have their own strong views. They are sometimes resistant to accepting regulation and control, to interacting with veterinarians, to registering their hives, to following the rules that are imposed to them. That is a weakness of the beekeeping sector, and a weakness typically prevents a sector to benefit from opportunities, or it prevents them to cope with eventual threats. However, here we were more interested in a very specific internal factor that was flagged as important, but neither as a clear strength or a clear weakness. And that was especially this one, and the fact that the European beekeeping sector and community is very diverse, with hobbyists and professionals, with a wide range also of reasons and motivations to keep bees. So that's something that in our further analysis, in the quantitative survey, we further analyzed. And I will come back to that later on. The other half of the SWOT concerns opportunities and threats. And here we did a similar exercise. So we had a long list of 29 external factors that shape the environment in which beekeeping is operating. And we boiled that down to 9 opportunities and 9 threats. And they were also evaluated in terms of their perceived importance and probability of occurrence. Probability of occurrence refers to whether that factor or trend is speeding up or slowing down, or expected to speed up or slow down. So the same type of graph where we have in the upper right part the threats indicated in red, the opportunities in green, and just again to mention a few. And so threat 22 in the upper right corner here refers to the rise of new bee pests and predators such as the Asian hornet, the hive beetle, that are, amongst others, linked to international trade. Opportunity 10, which is one of the most important opportunities because it ranks high in terms of that opportunity compared to the other opportunities. This has to do with advancements in risk assessment and analysis technologies, all kinds of methods for more robust tests, which provides the possibility to combat, for example, adulteration and fraud with apiary products. At the same time, here in this analysis, we also see here threat 2 and threat 3, and they were also attracting our attention because they both relate to climate change. Climate change causes geographical shifts in beekeeping and honey production, and it brings more irregular, more unpredictable and severe weather events. So because of this, we also decided to focus a bit more in depth on this particular topic. How do beekeepers perceive the threat from climate change? And that will also be covered further in the presentation. So first on the agenda next is the diversity among European beekeepers. So there is a strange character here saying hello to that honeybee on his arm. So a quite diverse population, those beekeepers. They are diverse in many respects. They are diverse in terms of their beekeeping practices. And in our survey, we had a list of about 30 possible practices, which we believed could flag good practices. And beekeepers were asked to indicate whether they consistently apply that practice, whether they usually apply that practice or never apply it. And based on their responses and internal discussions with beekeepers within the consortium, we boiled that list down to a set of 11 items, which, in our opinion, flag good beekeeping practices. The challenge here was to find a list of practices that are applicable to both hobbyists as well as professionals, that are applicable to beekeepers in Southern Europe as well as to beekeepers in Nordic countries. So taking into account that diversity. So in the end, we obtain here a 12-point index. It ranges from 0 to 11. 0 means I don't apply any of those practices, and I consistently don't apply any of them. Up to 11, a number of beekeepers who indicated, yes, I consistently apply any of those practices. So we have this index. This is the distribution, the histogram that has been shown. But interestingly, when we look at how this index associates with other characteristics, we find some very interesting and significant associations. This 12-point index, it associates significantly with lower winter losses, with higher honey yields, with a higher share of annual comb replacement. It also associates significantly with the application of a known closed wax cycle, with being professional rather than a hobbyist. The index was higher in Northern European countries, among Northern European beekeepers, also among female beekeepers. They constituted 12% of our sample, but they more consistently followed good practices. It also increased with more years active as a beekeeper, and it also was higher among beekeepers who inherited beekeeping from their parents or grandparents. So there is clearly also an element here of experience and expertise involved. This is one part of the diversity. Another factor that is causing diversity relates to the motivations to keep honeybees. And they can indeed be quite diverse, ranging from pure passion for honeybee keeping, passion for nature, up to a more economic orientation, my main source or a secondary source of income. And here you can see the distribution among the total sample. That doesn't flag any diversity yet, but in the next step in our analysis, we tried to identify beekeeper segments based on their orientation towards honeybees as being part of nature, that is this axis, and being rather representing market value. So those two dimensions, they do not exclude each other, they do not contradict each other, as you can also see from the position of the 5 segments that we identified. We gave them also a name, from passionate hobbyists over passionate skilled to the professionals, where you can clearly see that they have a strong utility or business orientation, but at the same time, they still score quite high on the natural, the effective orientation. Average cool and urban explorer. These were the terms that we used. What is their profile? Well, clockwise, so here, this urban explorer, that was typically a beekeeper with a low economic motivation. We show a relatively high share here of purely hobbyists, a relatively higher share as compared to the overall sample of urban beekeepers, starters, and Western European beekeepers. This does not mean that all of them were Western European. It simply means that Western European beekeepers are slightly overrepresented, but significantly overrepresented in this segment. Passionate hobbyists, they were the oldest beekeepers compared to the other segments. They had the smallest operation size and the lowest number of hives. There we found a higher share of female beekeepers, Strong passion, motivation, also Western Europe. Passionate, skilled, they had the highest score on the Good Beekeeping Management Practices Index, higher than the professionals. They had a more adherence to this 100% own closed wax cycle, strong passion motivation, and we found relatively more of those beekeepers in Southern European regions. Professionals, they were the youngest from the overall sample, highest honey yield per hive, strongest economic motivation. This segment was also outstanding with respect to migrating with their hives, which fits, of course, with their professional orientation. Also, own closed wax cycle and relatively more represented in Eastern Europe. And finally, average cool, lowest good beekeeping management practice index. They stood out in terms of a higher share of beekeepers who annually replace their queens, and independent of whether the queen has to be replaced or not, and relatively more represented in Northern European countries. So diversity among beekeepers was analyzed from different perspectives. I also referred to climate change, and that was an important topic in our stakeholder interviews. And we recently published a paper on this topic where we looked at how beekeepers experience and how they also perceive the impacts from climate change. We started that paper with these two quotes that I collected personally, not as part of Be Good, but simply by talking to people in this beekeeping sector. A colleague in Crete, in Greece, told me, okay, what used to be normal years in the past are now exceptionally good years, and what used to be exceptionally bad years are now normal years. And this French beekeeper here, who was selling apiary products at a farmer's market in the center of Paris, he said, well, if I compare to the situation when I was helping my father as a beekeeper, it's a night and day difference. And that tells a lot actually with respect to climate change. So we decided to further explore what's going on. The question here was, to what extent do you perceive an impact from climate change on beekeeping on different criteria, and to what extent do you experience that as a negative, a very negative, or rather perhaps even a positive impact? So on top we see local weather conditions, food resource availability, the occurrence of natural disasters, disease infestation, honey yields, and we see a lot of red over there. So mostly negative experienced impacts were reported by beekeepers. However, we also see a little bit of green sometimes. So the experienced impacts are not only negative. For example, on the length of the bee season, we see that some beekeepers indicated, well, this is an advantage. This is something that we can applaud climate change for. And the same here to some extent with food resource availability. So this was already indicating that in this story there are probably a lot of losers, but perhaps also some winners. And just when coming from the airport, there was a colleague with us from northern Germany, and I was asking about how the bee season was over there, and he said, well, actually extremely good. Northern Germany. Never seen an Asian hornet yet, so it's coming, I told him. But okay, so not only negative, so that's also, it's not only a bad news story. So we decided to look more in depth at who is now this beekeeper who feels heavily impacted by climate change. And we had two questions. Climate change had an impact, very negative to positive, on my beekeeping activities. And you see that overall, most most of the beekeepers had a negative reaction there, and this was especially the case in Southern Europe, followed by Eastern, Western, and Northern Europe. Second, I had to change my practices due to climate change. And again, we see that especially the Southern European beekeepers indicated that indeed they had to change their beekeeping practices. We combined those extremes, and beekeepers who reported very negative or negative on the left-hand side, combined with strongly agree on the right-hand side, they were classified by being heavily impacted by climate change. Altogether, that was almost 1/3 of our study sample. And next, we tried to model the determinants of feeling heavily impacted by climate change. We used the binary logistic regression model, and actually that model informed us that the likelihood of classifying as heavily impacted by climate change increases tenfold for Southern versus Northern European beekeepers. And it increases 31% per unit change from hobbyists to professionals. So it's especially the professionals that are heavily impacted. And the units there, that was a 5-point scale from a pure hobbyist to a fully professional beekeeper. It also increases 2% per year of being active as a beekeeper. So logically, it's especially the more experienced, the older beekeepers who can compare with the situation of 50 years ago, considering the age of many beekeepers. It also increases 34% as beekeeping is located in a forestry area, which indicates that the impacts of climate change are especially felt in forestry areas. And there are two positive signs here as well. Not surprising, it decreases that probability with 22% as colonies are surrounded by sufficient floral resources, and as there is a local policy that takes measures to address environmental issues. So that's also a little bit reassuring with respect to policy, because there seems to be a belief that, okay, policy can probably alleviate some of the problems here. We used those estimates from that model to simulate the likelihood of being heavily impacted by climate change as a beekeeper. And we did that for hobbyists, from hobbyists to professionals, and for each of the 4 European regions that were represented in our sample. And here you can see that this probability in Northern Europe ranges from 10 to 20%, whereas in Southern Europe it ranges from 50 up to 70 or 80%. So clearly illustrating both the impact of region as well as how professional beekeepers suffer more from climate change impacts than hobbyists. Finally, interest in adopting digital hive monitoring technology. So contrary to what I showed first, from a policy perspective, this is not a top priority. Among beekeepers, there is quite a strong interest, rather strong interest among beekeepers, and this for multiple reasons. If you look at the different reasons here, we see a lot of green over there, and that also fits with the stories that we have seen presented just before by Xiaodong and by Martin. However, if we look at the adoption so far, it is still rather low to moderate. Only 20% of the beekeepers in our sample, they indicated to digitally monitor at least one hive parameter. 668, they indicated to monitor nothing, at least not digitally. And the question is also, is what these are doing really digital? Because a lot of beekeepers, they have a weighing scale, and that's, you know. But what is interesting here is that with those 20%, most of them, they measure one parameter, and in most cases, that's either weight or temperature. Only 8 indicated to measure all 5, weight, temperature, humidity, sound, and number of bees. But these are really the innovators here. But what is interesting is that we should compare this 20%, so those here, with the so-called social tipping point of 25% for technology adoption. So in agricultural technology adoption literature, several authors refer to that 25% as a game changer. And once a technology becomes adopted by 25%, then it either takes off very rapidly or it collapses. So that indicates that it makes indeed a lot of sense to study this topic at the moment, because we are quite close to that social tipping point. Last part of our analysis here was using the theory of plant behavior to try to predict the adoption of hive monitoring technology. And this model of the theory of plant behavior says that basically it's the personal attitude that may matter to drive intention to behave. But on top of that, social norms, how others may influence a person, plays a role. And finally, also the perceived behavioral control, which is about facilitating conditions. If we look at the result from this analysis here, this number, it indicates that personal attitude emerges as the strongest driver of adoption. So at this moment, it's clearly a matter of a beekeeper being personally interested and motivated to adopt the technology, and otherwise this may not happen. But on top of that, social norm emerges also as a significant contributing factor to intention, and this is about how important other people influence the beekeeper's intention. For example, peer beekeepers or representatives of beekeeper associations or even scientists. And finally, perceived behavioral control, this last factor here, it also contributes significantly to intention and behavior, and also directly. And this one refers to how easy or how difficult the beekeeper believes it is to adopt the technology. If a beekeeper would be very convinced that it is very difficult to adopt the technology, then we would have a negative sign here. So also, if the beekeeper would perceive this as extremely expensive, so that's a non-facilitating condition, then we would have expected a negative sign. So it's positively contributing. So that means that beekeepers also believe to have control over that behavior, over that adoption. So that's also a positive factor in this story. So conclusions. In the socioeconomic research activities of BeGood, we managed to collect a lot of insights, a lot of quantitative data, both from stakeholders and beekeepers. We identified the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and we even used that to formulate key attention points for future policy development. We have this good beekeeping management practices index. We initiated the construction of that. It of course needs some further fine-tuning, but perhaps it can be an interesting point to further research. We identified and profiled distinct beekeeper segments. We analyzed the diverse impacts from climate change and how they are experienced by beekeepers. And finally, last part of the analysis that we did and showed is about the determinants of hive monitoring technology adoption. So that being said, thanks for your attention, and during the discussion, I also welcome your questions.
Okay, as always, as done the day before, we start the questioning here in the room, and then we go to online guests. So keep the microphone ready, and I see Raffaele has already a question. Does it work? No, we take the other one. Yeah.
So
Thank you, Wim, for this overview of all of the data we collected through the survey. I want to ask some clarification because when in the sector 3 of your presentation, when you were giving the profile of the beekeeper and the diversity of the beekeeper, when you ranked according to the GBMP score, you said that Northern Europe were Northern European beekeepers were the ones scoring the highest. Did I got it correctly? So for me, which I'm from Italy, is not surprising at all, I have to admit. But in the next slide, when you categorized the 5 main clusters, then you said that how do you call passionate, skilled, they were the one ranking higher, but coming from Southern Europe. And then the cluster number 5, that were the cool, I don't know, remember the name, they were scoring the lowest and coming from the north. How can interpret this?
Yeah, it's a difference that it's due to either bivariate or multivariate comparison. So it is indeed true that in terms of the Good Beekeeping Management Practice Index, we saw a significantly higher mean score among the Northern European beekeepers. But then in the profiling of the segments, as I said, that segment that has a significant overrepresentation of Northern European beekeepers does not consist only of Northern European beekeepers. So there are also many other beekeepers, maybe Southern European beekeepers, that then lower that Good Beekeeping Management Practice Index in that specific segment. So it has to do with either bivariate comparison or looking at the profile of a segment with multiple variables at the same time. Yeah.
Hi, Nuno here. I also have a question. Regarding, it's more or less for the same thing when you had that graph with the natural orientation or business orientation, and we have 5 different classes. I think it would be really interesting if this analysis could be made per country, because, I mean, beekeepers have replied to these questionnaires, and it's good for them to have an overview at the European level. But I think if I were a beekeeper from Portugal, I would like to see my data and how is the beekeeping sector in my country. Would that be possible?
That would be possible for some of the countries, because in several countries we had a low number of respondents. For example, this kind of analysis would require at least a sample of 80 beekeepers. And I think we, in the total sample, we only have 5 or 6 countries. Perhaps also in Portugal, we had around 70 or 80 beekeepers. So that may be feasible. But the number is low, considering that we have 5 clusters. But that can indeed be done, yeah, if the sample size is big enough.
Okay, then
there was just to double check. There was one question and one remark from Bee Live. So if Noah is still online, she can take the floor.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello.
Yes, so thank you for the presentation. We'd like to just as a reminder, what is considered a quality inspector, and who did you include it into there?
Quality inspector in our stakeholders were people who were involved with government inspection. That can either be veterinarian inspections or the Food Safety Authority, for example.
Okay, so it's authorities actually.
Yeah, but they are not policy makers, so
yeah. They are implementers.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I have it was a little bit more a remark. So I don't know, like I really have my doubts that the criteria used for the external validity that you use for the survey is relevant. Because I mean, if I understand correctly, you use this validity to check if your sample is kind of representative, no?
Based on that external validity check, I would not claim that my sample is representative, because I'm convinced that the other samples are also not representative. The beekeeping sample is also not representative.
So for what did you use the external validity?
Just to check if the gradient that we obtained in our sample, if that matches with data that were collected for other purposes and by means of other methodologies.
Okay.
Because also we received a remark from a reviewer at some point, and that said, well, but how do you know whether your sample in any sense corresponds to the characteristics of the beekeeping community? So we thought, well, let's have a look at honey yield per hive, and let's have a look at winter losses. And this is how we came to that indication of external validity. But that does not imply a claim that our sample is representative. It is not representative because it was an online data collection, for example. And there is still a large number of beekeepers who are not online in some of the countries that were included. Some of the countries are strongly represented. Some of the countries are almost not or not represented at all. So we cannot claim representativeness.
Okay. I think, well, we will exchange via email, because then I don't understand these two parameters that you brought somehow. And in which way they were, because I mean, they were used because it's, as you said, the diversity of the diversity that we have in the beekeeping sector is not only attached to the diversity of beekeeping ways, but even in the diversity of measurements of colony losses, of yields. So actually, we could go from 0 to 100, and it would still be in the range. So I don't know. I was a little puzzled, let's say, just when when you use these criteria and to see if they were valid or not.
For this presentation, I made a selection of two factors that may relate to diversity and practices, but indeed on top of that there are different breeds, there are different operation sizes. In our sample, it ranged from a couple of hives to the maximum of 6,000 hives. That was, of course, also a unique case. So in our reports, also we profiled the fully professional beekeeper. We profiled female starter beekeepers, urban beekeepers, and so on. So we looked at diversity among beekeepers in more ways than the ones that were just shown here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Are there further questions from that's all? Okay. Thank you, Wim, for a nice presentation. And give him a